Hello, I'm Pastor John at the Baptist Church in the Great Valley, and today's message is taken from Genesis chapter 19. 2 months ago, there was an enormous explosion at the port in Beirut, Lebanon. 2,750 tons of volatile ammonium nitrate had been stored illegally in one of the warehouses, and when it exploded, it produced a blast that was felt as far away as Turkey and Syria and Israel. It was even picked up by the seismometers of the U.S. Geologic Survey. It was so loud that the blast was heard on the island of Cyprus, 160 miles away. The explosion killed 200 people. It caused 6,500 casualties. It caused $15 billion in property damage and left some 300,000 people homeless. The disaster has been studied by a team in Sheffield, England, who declared it one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. The investigation has focused on the illegal storage of a dangerous substance, and Interpol has already received warrants for 2 suspects, and more may follow. While it was a terrible tragedy, the explanation that I gave probably makes sense to you. But 4,000 years ago, before the explosive power of nitrates was understood, most people would have looked for a theological explanation rather than a scientific one to explain the disaster. If this explosion had taken place during the day of Abraham, it's likely that they would have understood this as a direct act of God. For some reason, an angry God had punished the city, and there must have been some really evil things going on until God finally had enough and punished it. Well, this was their frame of reference and how they made sense of what was happening in the world. Even today, there are those who choose to understand the tragedies of life as the direct intervention of God. The Archbishop of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church declared that the COVID pandemic is God's judgment upon a sinful world that tolerates homosexuality. Well, Jesus warned us that it's not our place to go around judging others, and it seems that now the Archbishop has come down with COVID himself, which may require a bit of theological backpedaling. Back in the 1990s, archaeologists began to survey the site of the ancient Iraqi city of Mashkan Shapir on the Euphrates River. This city had been destroyed by a firestorm, a tremendous conflagration. It had obviously been destroyed by a terrible fire that incinerated the bodies to dust and charred the bones. The only question that the archaeologists were trying to struggle with was, how did this happen? What was there in this city to burn? I mean, the homes and the structures had all been built from mud bricks. Yes, there was some wood in the roof and some thatch. Yes, there were probably some grass mats inside the homes. But the remains of this catastrophe suggested something a whole lot larger and more sinister and hot enough to bake the bricks as if they had been in a kiln. Well, as you might suspect, that area is rich in hydrocarbons. There are huge reserves of crude oil down under the sand, as as well as domes of odorless natural gas. Under pressure from the sand above, the gas and the oil can migrate underground. And as a result of earthquakes that can split and crack open the rocks, sometimes these fossil fuels and hydrocarbons will make their way up to the surface where they're released. In the presence of a cooking fire as an ignition source, suddenly you have an apocalyptic firestorm that is so intense that it burned the bodies to dust and leaving only charred bones. The people of the surrounding area must have said, wow, the gods must have been really, really angry to punish those people that way. Wonder what they did to deserve it. Now, most archaeological sites are like layer cakes, where new cities are built upon the ruins of the old. Why stay in the same spot? Well, for the very reasons that the city was built there to begin with. Perhaps there was drinking water or fertile fields. Perhaps there's a harbor or a river for transportation. Despite the city's destruction, these things would still be there. The streets would still be laid out, the foundations would still be there, ready to be built on. There would be stones and building materials strewn about that could be reused. Perhaps there were also wells that had been dug. So, it was much easier to build on the ruins than it was to build brand new from scratch. But no one has ever built upon the ruins of Mashkin Shaper. The place was cursed. People chose to stay as far away from it as possible. So unlike other ancient cities, this one was never rebuilt for the last 4,000 years. So now let's turn our attention to Sodom, which was destroyed roughly the same time. Today, no one knows exactly where Sodom was. There is speculation that the location is now covered by the shallow end, the southern end of the Dead Sea. But again, no one really knows where it was or how it was destroyed. Again, there are those that suggest that the ignition of gases or petrochemicals that are found in the area caused the city to be destroyed in a firestorm. Others have suggested that the explosion of a meteor might have destroyed the cities of the valley. You may recall reading about a massive blast in 1908 over a remote Siberian forest known as the Tunguska event. In seconds, the shock wave from the explosion flattened more than 80 million trees. It flattened an area spanning some 800 square miles. Such is the destructive power of an exploding meteor. So we really don't know what happened to Sodom, although we read that Abraham, who was some 30 miles away in the city of Hebron, saw the columns of smoke from the burning city. As I think thick columns of black smoke. It's far more suggestive of an oil fire than a meteor. But how did the people of that age explain it? Lacking any scientific explanation, they decreed that it was an act of God to punish evil people. And to be punished in such a cataclysmic way suggests that their sins were very dark indeed. In Genesis chapter 19, we find this very peculiar and ancient story. In no other story in the Bible do we find angels being sent out to spy out the land. I mean, presumably an omniscient, all-knowing God would already know the situation there. And when the angels arrived at the city gates, Lot, Abraham's nephew, behaved properly, according to the standards and values of the day, and invited the strangers into his home. Hospitality, you see, was a paramount value in that day. In that hot, dry, hostile land, you never knew when your life might depend upon the kindness and hospitality of others. So it was absolutely necessary that you, in turn, be hospitable, providing water and food and a safe place to spend the night. But in contrast to Lot's excellent example, we have the horrifying story of the men of the town gathering outside of Lot's door, wanting to gang rape the visitors. Let me be clear now. This is not a story or a lesson about human sexuality. This is a story about God's judgment upon people using power and domination and violence to humiliate the weak and the vulnerable. Sounds more like a story we would get from the prison system or out of a POW camp. It just doesn't sound like something we would find in the Bible. But the angels protect Lot and his family. And the following morning, they take them by the hand and they hurry them out of the town just before the place was incinerated. A final, strange detail is added as they warn Lot's wife not to look back. But she does, and is turned into a pillar of salt. Again, I can't think of another story in the Bible that is anything like that. Apparently, this detail was added to explain the weird salt pillars that are found at the south end of the Dead Sea. They're a strange phenomenon that we might appreciate a scientific explanation for as to their formation. But in that day, the explanation again was theological. She was warned, don't look back, but she did. She got what she deserved. So this little passage in Genesis 19 provides us with two lessons. Don't be a bully or violate the standards of hospitality, and don't look back. So what happens when we read ancient stories based upon ancient structures of thought and assumptions that simply are not in harmony with our modern understandings? Well, quite honestly, people begin to create their own lessons. There are any number of peculiar stories at the beginning of Genesis that have been torn from their context and have been used to justify sinful human behavior. The story of the fall and the ejection from the Garden of Eden was used to justify male domination of females. The story of the flood was used to justify the enslavement and the placing into servitude of the black races. The story of Sodom is turned on its head and used to justify the mistreatment, the contempt, and bullying of the small segment of the population that was genetically programmed to seek love and intimacy from their own gender. But we must use the Bible to interpret the Bible. In chapter 1 of Isaiah, the prophet had a message for the leaders of Jerusalem, and he began by calling them the rulers of Sodom. Wow, why did he call them that? Were they these lecherous old guys wandering the streets at night looking for someone to victimize? Not at all. They were the most religious of the religious. They were very careful that their sacrifices were made properly and on time, and that everything was done decently and in order. To which God says, I'm sick of it. And reading from chapter 1. I've had enough of your offerings. I take no pleasure in the blood of bulls or lambs or goats. The incense you burn is an abomination, and I hate your religious festivals. Righteousness once dwelt in the city. Now it's full of murderers. Your rulers are rebels and the companions of thieves. Everyone loves a bribe. They do not defend the orphan, nor does the widow's plea come before them. Cease to do evil. Learn to do good. Seek justice. Reprove the ruthless. Defend the orphan. Plead for the widow. So for Isaiah, the ultimate evil is going through the religious motions and rituals while ignoring the people in need that are crying out to God for help. The prophet Ezekiel also used the story of Sodom as a simile for sin. Preaching to the people of Jerusalem, he said, you all remember the story of Sodom? But the people of Sodom were only half as bad as you people are. The sin of Sodom was that she was haughty and arrogant. She had abundant food and careless ease. But she did not help the poor and the needy. The sin of Sodom was about putting people down rather than lifting people up. As Christians, we believe that our sins have been forgiven and that we have been saved by God's grace. But it is also a good idea to keep in mind what righteousness looks like. Reading from the book of Job. I delivered the poor who cried, and the orphan who had no helper. The blessing of the wretched came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy, and I championed the cause of the stranger. May God help us to do the right thing. Amen.